Hello and welcome, college students, early career journalists, and everyone who is joining us today. I am so excited for this discussion on how to negotiate your first salary. So first of all, why is learning how to negotiate so important? Because what you get paid for that first salary is going to set the foundation for every salary, every raise that you get after that. Now, what's really interesting, and I think a lot of people don't know, is that nearly 3/4 of employers are actually expecting you to negotiate when you go into a job interview and you get to that salary discussion. But more than half of people, 55%, don't ask for a higher salary. So there's a complete disconnect there. So today, you're going to learn how to advocate for yourself, plus what you need to be doing to show hiring managers that you are worth more money. Plus, we've got new data from Arizona State that shows that business journalist salaries are higher than those of traditional journalists. So without further ado, my name is Cindy Perman. I am previously with the Wall Street Journal and CNBC. And joining us today, I'm so excited for our panelists. Alexandra Carter is a professor at Columbia Law School who teaches negotiation skills. She is also the author of Ask for More, 10 Questions to Negotiate Anything. John Yearwood is the editorial director for diversity and culture at Politico. And Jeffrey Timmermans is the director of the Reynolds National Center for Business Journalism at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State. And previously, before he went into the academic world, he was a managing editor at Dow Jones Newswires. So we have some great panelists today, and so I would love to jump right in. Alex, can you tell me from your perspective why it's important to negotiate?
Yeah, Cindy. So welcome to everybody who's on the call, and thanks to you and everyone who set this up today. So negotiation is critically important for a few reasons. The first is when Cindy said that this sets the foundation for the rest of your professional life, it does so in a really meaningful way. You know, there have been studies done about folks who came out of graduate school, and those who negotiated, even if they got, 10% more, all of their future raises and promotions were then based upon that, 10% more, which meant that they could then retire, assuming everything else stayed the same. Promotions and raises from then on out, they needed to work 6 or 7 years longer to retire at the same level, right? So it's really meaningful when you go out and you negotiate, even if you think it's a small amount for your first salary, that adds up over time. Number two, if I can just say this, Cindy, that when you negotiate for yourself, you're teaching the company or the institution how to value you. You're teaching them how to see you as a future leader. And so they know that that's the kind of person then that's going out on behalf of the institution, and you're really showing them your value from minute one.
Alex, that was one of my favorite pieces of advice from you. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I think so many of us, we actually think when we are talking about negotiating, we think, okay, so the things about negotiating are who throws out the number first, and what do I say with this or that or whatever. We go right to the math or whatever. And so I love that. I read that in your book, actually, and you say that it starts much sooner than the numbers, right? It's about that teaching those hiring managers on the other side of the table how to value you. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, negotiation, when we see it in, movies and television shows, what they're showing is the last stages. They're showing these high stakes haggling battles over money. That is not where it starts. In my work as a mediator, so at Columbia, I actually help entities and people negotiate really high stakes disputes. And what I tell them is the numbers we do at the end, right? But right from the beginning, we are painting a picture with our words about who we are, our qualifications, the value that we're going to bring, and what that means with the company. And that sounds like we might need somebody to mute. I don't know if we've got a feedback.
Oh, sorry about that. It might be my phone, actually.
I think it might be Jeff since he just joined.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Good. Okay.
All right. I'm still hearing it, Cindy. I don't know if you're hearing it.
I can't hear it at all. I don't know. Tess and Tobin, can you hear it?
I can, yes. I just muted you, Cindy. So Alex, can you try speaking again?
Okay, absolutely. Well, and guys, look, this is, just like negotiation, right? We're all negotiating with the technology here. And it's all about, right, thinking about how am I going to set this up from the beginning, right? By asking some really good questions, finding out what they value most, how I can match that with my words. And so then by the time we get to the numbers later in the conversation, I've set the stage that they're already thinking about me in a certain way. So you've got to get the messages right to get the kind of numbers that you're looking for later on.
I really appreciate that advice. I mean, I think it's really important for that starting from the beginning. John, I'd love to bring you in at this point and just ask you, from your perspective, you've done a lot of hiring in your career, including currently at Politico. Do you see a lot of journalists negotiating or coming in and trying to negotiate?
Hi, Cindy. Thanks for inviting me, and certainly thanks to SABEW and others who are involved in creating this conversation. In terms of negotiations, I've been hiring folks now for 20 plus years, and I'm seeing more negotiations now than before. Not that people did not negotiate before, but I think it's increasingly becoming a feeling among many that that negotiations are important, and for some of the reasons that that Alex talked about. I mean, it is if you don't do it now, then you're literally missing out on a significant portion of income over time. So I'm seeing a lot more of it now than before.
Alex, that's very encouraging. Alex, I wanted to ask you, can you just kind of maybe help us start from the beginning about all right, so now I know I need to negotiate. What are some things I can be doing, like maybe a couple of key steps for what I can be doing as I'm heading into that interview?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I would say is to be doing some research. This seems basic, but when we go in and we're thinking, again, I don't want to wait till the end to be researching salary. I want to think about all the sources of information that are available to me, right? And now we have much more than we ever did before, right, John? And I wonder to what extent some of that, the pay transparency laws are now playing into people feeling emboldened to negotiate, right? Because let's be honest, normally in a job situation, there's an information asymmetry, isn't there, right? You have the company that has all the information on what they have paid everyone. And then you have a bunch of folks who are like one-shotters, right? They are negotiating with that organization and they don't have that information. So what I would recommend is if your company, your institution doesn't have pay ranges listed, then I'd be looking at what else is out there in the profession for competitors, for similar jobs. Get a sense of what the range is. And that's where you can start there. There are sites like, Indeed or Glassdoor, PayScale, where you can get some information. But always what I tell people is human intelligence is the best, right? So if I'm applying for a job and John and I know each other from college, right? Maybe we were on student government together and I know that John has a job at this company. I might call John and say, hey, would you mind giving me a sense of what the salary range is, or what are the different types of things that people can negotiate for upon entering, right? So tap your networks to figure out who you can get to help you. So researching. You also want to research yourself. That may sound strange, but you want to think about how you're packaging your strength. And here's where I'm just going to tell a quick personal story, okay? I applied for a job reluctantly about 16 years ago that I didn't think I was going to get because I looked at the list of qualifications and I thought, do I really meet those? Okay. And I had to force myself to go ahead and do it. I was a huge underdog for the position, but I came in, I was the youngest person they were interviewing and I knew it. And I came in by talking about what I did have. The position, spoiler alert, was to be a professor at Columbia Law School, where I've now been for 15 years. Okay, so my first advice to you is just go for it, right? Even if you think you don't meet all the qualifications, I was doing what especially, women often do, which is to say, I don't meet 110% of this. Am I really qualified to apply? But I led with what I did have. Yes, I'm more junior, but I'm closer to your student's experience. I was a student in this course recently. I went out and then had experience. And so I now know I can reverse engineer what we want to be teaching people. And by the way, if you want somebody to stay for 30 years and really build your program with a lot of vision and energy, that's me. Similar to you, maybe you don't have a ton of experience, but you have recent education. You might have technology experience that other people don't have. So I want you to start from your strengths always. You have more leverage than you think. And the last thing is treating the boss as your partner. Right? A lot of times people approach negotiation like it's adversarial, but if John and I or Jeff and I are negotiating over salary, guess what? They're my partner once this deal is done, right? We're working together. And so I want you to think about how you can create the atmosphere of I'm excited and I also know my value and I want something that's going to work really well for both of us. So I can make this my long-term home.
I think that is all such amazing advice, and I really appreciate it because I feel like just those couple of things give people a real blueprint. And, when I talk to students, I really think of that because I remember going into, big media organizations and being intimidated by the person across the table, or even intimidated by the 20-somethings who were already on the other side, and thinking, what kind of leverage do I have? I don't have anything to offer. I just got out of school. What you're saying, you have the freshest degree, the newest technology, and some of the things John and I were talking about yesterday, even more so than our generation, you probably come out having done a podcast or having been clipped video or having, whatever the case may be, doing social media, like all of these skills that like journalists who are older don't necessarily have. And so it's so important to, I think, not just research the company, but to research yourself and figure out what you have to offer and realize that I feel like that's like one of the key moments for me from your advice is like to, what you have to offer because you have more than you think. So John, I want to talk to you. We had talked about that a little bit. Some of the things that, you're going to be the guy on the other side of the table. So, and I think it's really important to know that, you don't just walk in and say, hey, I deserve more, right? Or I want more because I need more to pay my rent. So I'm curious, like some of the things, and I know now, just to be clear, by the way, we are not saying if you say XYZ, you will definitely get more money. But John, what are some of the things that that people will say in an interview or that they'll bring to the table that they'll have to offer that might make you either want to hire them or make them higher value on the salary scale?
Well, a couple of things. Well, first of all, yeah, you definitely don't say I need more to pay my rent or I need more to go to the mall, right? You don't want to do that, although probably at some level you do. Let me mention a couple of things that would be very helpful. In some cases, we hire people who have come through our internship program, and in some cases, our fellowship program. One of the things that you need, even though we know this, it's always good to reiterate some of the major stories that you did during that period. Talk about one of the things that we value highly is scoops. Talk about the scoops that you have, the stories that you have broken, which is really, really big for us. Talk about how you have been, one of the things that we're big on at Politico is collaboration, how you've been a collaborator with other departments, things that go to our values. And, if you bring those things out and how your time with us has really benefited the company or the newsroom as a whole, or if you're coming in from the outside, talk about how you've done those things at the news organizations where you're coming from. I think those things would make us think twice, and also add how you anticipate doing those and even more once you start this job. How excited you are to begin it. You want to do this, and in some cases, and I've seen where some new hires have said, here's my plan for the job once I started. So those things are really important when you're going in to negotiate and asking for more. And if I should mention one other thing, when you're asking for more, you need to be careful of where you put the commas and the periods. One of a former colleague was asking for more, and one of the things that he did, instead of putting a period, he put a comma between the 6 zeros. So he was asking for several $1 million. And I had to call him up and said, I know you've been amazing and you are great and you're going to do incredible things, but that's a bit much.
I don't know, John, you're giving me some ideas. I mean, I feel like I might write to my dean and ask for, $20 million and say, oops, this was a typo. Good stuff.
Certainly.
But actually, when he did catch it, he no, what I was mentioning that when he did catch it, he was really funny. He sent a note saying that the many millions I asked for is great, but what I really wanted is a little smaller amount, and that's good too.
That is very important. And certainly as journalists, right, punctuation is important. Yeah, I think, John, it makes sense when you say it that way, right? And I don't think we always think of it that way, right? Like going in, like thinking of the other candidates we're up against. If I come in and I say, look, John, at my past job, I broke a lot of scoops and here's links to those scoops that I broke or whatever. I mean, right then and there, if we are equal in our reporting, right? I mean, I feel like that's going to set me above other people, right? Because that's what you're looking for, So I think it's really important for students to think about that. And, you don't have to have had a previous big media job. I mean, that would be great. But I mean, if you see some of the recent stories we've seen, there are students breaking stories at their student newspapers. So there are ways that you can be doing these things and taking advantage of things now. And I think, John, one of the other things we talked about is things like, if you are doing podcasts or you are doing public speaking, right? Or you have language skills, like these are things that will be readily transferable, right? Because if I'm a reporter for you coming in, you might need me to go do my story on a podcast or something, right? Or go speak to students at a recruiting, conference or something.
Absolutely, Cindy. And you're talking about student journalists breaking stories now. I mean, one of the things that many of us have been reading about over the last few days is the story coming out of Northwestern, where the student newspaper there has really been kicking butt on the story about the coach. So if you come to Politico with that kind of, with those kinds of stories, and say you were deeply involved in breaking those stories, and in that's something that we would really want. So it's really important to make those points clear when you're negotiating. And you've done that there, and you can do it here. That's really important.
And the other thing, we were talking about too is like, if I come in with expertise in different beats, even maybe, and it doesn't even have to be that, oh, I did this at CNBC or somewhere. It could be that, it's something that I spent time researching or whatever. Like we talk about artificial intelligence, right? Like something that a lot of us in the business don't really know a lot about, that students might come in and know about, and that could be setting you apart if you have an expertise in something,
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, you mentioned artificial intelligence. We're dealing now with one of our young people who came in knowing a lot more about almost everybody in the newsroom about AI, which put her in a very powerful position in terms of negotiating a salary and really being able to convince us that she'll be a major contributor going forward.
I love that. And I love that, like, it's something that we can even be doing like over the summer. Like, let's say we don't have a job over the summer, and, you're still looking, you just graduated or something like that. These are things you can be doing instead of waiting and just sending out resumes, is kind of building some expertise in things, getting some certifications or that kind of thing. So I love those. I love all those tips and
Hey,
language.
Cindy, if I can go back, if you don't mind, going back to a point that Alex made earlier, talking about personal intelligence, reaching out to people who have that job or people at that company. What I'm seeing is that, particularly among young people, is that using social media, they are finding out and connecting with their peers at other organizations and finding out, in some cases, exactly what they received, and so that when they get an offer, they have a much better sense of, one, whether it's a fair offer, and it gives them, an additional lever to pull when they are responding to the offer. In some cases, saying that I know, and they don't say how they know, but they know that so and so, this other person received with similar skills, received this much more than you're offering me. So, and it, to some extent, it puts the employer in a box, if you will, to say, okay, having to justify why they are paying you less than than the person that doing the same job.
Yeah, I think that's really important to be using that network. I mean, we're all on LinkedIn, and in fact, on this registration page, if you guys notice, the links to all of the panelists and to myself, those are all LinkedIn links. So click on them, learn more about all of your panelists, and learn more about, you can feel free to connect with all of us. And I just want to take this opportunity to mention too, I'm going to be asking some of my most pressing questions of these guys, but please drop your questions in the chat if you have them. We will be happy to take some questions from everyone in the audience at the end. And, John, one thing I also was noticing, and I remember this from when I was hiring at CNBC, I think it's really important for students to, and early career journalists to be researching the company, right? To be knowing, like, if I'm coming into an interview with you, right, to know some of the things you've been doing recently, to know some of, your reporters, and just, know some of the things coming in. And then kind of figuring out where I fit in. I feel like all of these things really kind of help shape and kind of present what we have to offer, coming in the door. And I think it's really important to do that because, as Alex was saying, this all starts before you get there, right? When I walk into an interview, by doing all of these things, I am telling the hiring manager how to value me, right? So by giving them all that, we're starting from a higher place already once we actually get to the numbers. So I think that's all really great advice. John, I wanted to ask you one other thing, language skills. Are there any language skills that are particularly more desirable than others coming into Politico?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, coming into Politico, one of the things that is really big for us now is in terms of coverage of China. So if you come in and you have, the Chinese, that would put you really ahead of certainly others who don't, particularly as we look at covering that area, which is increasingly important for us. There's a lot happening now in Ukraine and Russia. And if you are, either the language or you spend time as a student in that region, I think that's really important. I tell people that, when you're in school, one of the best things that you could do if you're interested in going into the media is to spend a semester or a year abroad. It really broadens your perspective. In some cases, you pick up a language, but it teaches you so much about different cultures, and so that when you're coming into an interview and you're talking about that, I think that also another thing that puts you ahead of someone who did not do those kinds of things. Doesn't necessarily mean that you would absolutely get the job, but at least it certainly makes you a bit more desirable than others.
Thank you so much. That's all really good advice. I think we've given students a nice list of things to kind of be thinking about as they go in there, of what you can bring for value. I'd like to bring Jeffrey Timmermans from the Reynolds Center at the Walter Cronkite School at Arizona State. Jeffrey, welcome to the panel. I wanted to ask you about salaries. ASU just put out a recent study about journalism salaries. And I think one thing going in, and Alex said this at the start, that's so important is there's no reason now why you can't like get a ballpark of what salaries are when you're going in to apply for a job. And so the range going in, nothing is a surprise when you get there. And then you have these tools to figure out, how to try to get yourself on the higher end of that range. So Jeffrey, what can you tell us about journalism salaries based on your recent survey?
Well, I can tell you the biggest takeaway from our survey is that business journalists make more money. We've been doing this survey now for 2 years, and quite frankly, the reason we started doing this survey was to show journalism students that business journalism is a fantastic career. You're going to make more money, and you're going to have more opportunities for growth than you will in almost any other field. And business journalism as a business has traditionally been a little bit more lucrative than general news, because business news, as we all know, has value. People are willing or more willing to pay for it. And that translates into salaries. So our most recent data showed that business journalists made a significant percentage. Sorry, I got to get my numbers here. They had sorry, I'm getting a bit of an echo on myself here. But they made more than 30,000 per year on average more than general news journalists. So that's a significant premium. And this should certainly factor into your negotiations for salary when you're when you're talking about it in your job. Now, certainly you shouldn't go in there and say, hey, I'm a business journalist, give me $30,000 more. But it's certainly evidence that you can expect a bit of a premium if you're angling for a business journalism job.
That's really good. Good to know. Yeah, actually, that was so interesting when I saw those numbers. Actually, so it was 30,000 is not that's really surprising. I think I knew that business journalism salaries tended to pay more. I have one question for you on that. Do you have a sense, a thought about why they tend to pay more than traditional news salaries?
Well, I think it does get back to my point earlier that business journalism is a better business than general news. And just to give an example, I worked at the Wall Street Journal for many years, Dow Jones Newswires. And if we remember back at the dawn of the internet age, the age that basically destroyed the old advertising model for supporting journalism, one of the very first websites back in 1995, news websites, to have a paywall right from the very beginning was WSJ.com. Even from the beginning of the internet age, when people started getting more of their news from the internet, they demonstrated a willingness to actually pay for financial news that was not there for general news.
And have you noticed a difference? Is there any gender pay gap in the study that you guys did?
Sadly, yes. It has been there, as you know, for a very long time. It is there in business journalism. Now, we've only been doing this survey for 2 years, so it's very hard to draw conclusions. However, we are seeing in these past 2 years, the gender gap narrowing. And what's most important is our data show that for younger journalists, those 35 and under, the gender pay gap between male and female journalists is almost non-existent. So there's some evidence there that that gap is at least narrowing for younger journalists. And we hope that that will stay narrow or the gap be completely eliminated as those journalists go up in their careers.
Yes, let's definitely hope so. So I'd like to go back to Alex for a minute. Alex, do you have any advice for, if we have any female journalists here looking to close that gap, or just reasons, and obviously it's different for every person, there isn't a generalization, but do you think that there's any tips that you might provide for how female journalists can help try to close that gap a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'll first say that not all women are equally situated. right? So there's a lot of research to show that Black women in particular get much more paid pushback than I would negotiating salary, especially over numbers, right? And I see Jeff nodding, right? You've seen that, I'm sure. And even looking at some of your data, a lot of, when you were talking about your gap, a lot of the folks were white, right? In this particular, the respondents that you got from this survey. So I just want to start out by acknowledging we don't have one pay gap, right? In this country, we have many, right? And as a white woman, I am, I'm only walking one tightrope in the workplace while my sisters of color are walking two, right? So there's that. So the first thing I would say is if you happen to be, if we've got a senior woman on this call, or, a senior man who's in a position, right? Like John, somebody who's the hiring manager, just want to say that that's where ultimately it starts. I give advice all the time to women and underrepresented people in negotiation. I'm all about controlling what we can control. That being said, there are systemic forces at work, right? And so this has to start from the top. I want to acknowledge that. And if you are, what we would call an underrepresented person, right? If you're a woman in business journalism, if you are a person of color and you've ever hesitated to negotiate for yourself, there are some rational reasons for that, because sometimes you're met with somebody on the other side who may think about it differently. Hopefully not most people, right? But sometimes we absorb the message that's out there in the atmosphere that we should be lucky to be there. And I have to tell you this, I know this from personal experience, because I almost didn't negotiate my first salary. I was trained in negotiation. I was an excellent negotiator for other people. I had lots of credentials. And yet I got a good offer and I almost took it on the spot. But I had just enough on the ball to call a senior woman in my field, right? To say, thank you, I'm going to run my numbers. I'll get back to you next week. Called a senior woman and I said, hey, I got this good offer. What should I do? And she said, I'm going to tell you what to do, Alex. You're going to get back in there and you're going to ask for more. And here's why. Because when you teach someone how to value you, you are teaching him how to value all of us. So if you're not going to go in there and negotiate for yourself, I want you to think of the woman coming after you, do it for the sisterhood. So my advice is, first of all, if you're hesitating to negotiate because you're a collaborative person, congratulations, you're a great negotiator. Your collaborative spirit, your ability to ask open, great questions, your ability to partner with the person on the other side of the table and engender trust is going to help you. It's going to help you as a reporter, and it's going to help you establish the kind of connection that is going to, assist in your negotiation. Second thing I want you to know is that it actually benefits your employer when you negotiate. Why? Have you ever undervalued yourself for anything? Maybe it was even a job during college. You didn't ask for everything you could have for your hourly wage. How do you feel when you show up for that job? Oftentimes resentful, right? At the other person and at yourself. Your employer deserves the version of you that shows up when you feel fully valued. Everybody deserves that version, right? So that's why I always say, a lot of research on negotiation. You want to have a specific request. You want it to be justifiable, right? So it's got to be based on comps or, based in reality, but it also needs to be optimistic. And so what that means for me is that is the largest number or the largest range or package that you can credibly say with a straight face, right? That's what it means. They're expecting you to negotiate. And I know, Cindy, we have something in the notes about what if you're afraid they're going to rescind the offer, right? And I know, John, I'm sure, and Jeff, you've heard all of these stories out there in the ether. This is more rare than people think it is, right? Because you hear one instance of this and it sticks in your mind, right? It's a psychological phenomenon. But also, may I just say, if that happens to you, that is a red flag on the part of the company. If you've approached this collaboratively, if you come from a fact-based place and they're like, we are so outraged that you're trying to negotiate that we're going to rescind the offer, right? That's a tough place to be. And it's probably for the best that that's not going to work out. If I can just say one more thing, something John said that really struck me and I thought was such great advice. John, you were talking about language skills, right? But it reminded me that bringing in the whole of who you are is really important in an interview. That could be language skills that maybe you didn't even acquire in college. I actually took Chinese in college, John, for that reason. I thought I might end up being a journalist. And in fact, Jeff, I went to work for Goldman Sachs because I thought that's the first stop. I'm going to get some education. And then I ended up in law school and on a different path, right? But maybe I didn't learn that in college. Maybe if I were a different person, I learned that at home. Maybe I come from a particular background where other people of that background are going to want to talk to me as sources, right? Maybe I bring a perspective that other people don't have. The news report I can remember most from the last few years was a New York Times reporter who had grown up in poverty, doing a story on food insecurity during the pandemic. I heard her on the Daily. I cried in my car. I will never forget that. It impacted me. It stuck with me. So tell people who you are. That's part of your value to that organization, especially if you have extra skills, lived experiences that make you an underrepresented resource.
I love all of that. Yeah, I think it's so important. I mean, and think about, Russian, right? Or, before, during the Cold War, that was sort of a language skill that was in demand. It wasn't so much. And then out of nowhere, right, comes this war. And so you really never know. And so I think that's one thing, Alex, that I really love is because when you bring your full self, right, I'm telling you things about me that you may need to know down the road. When that happened, people are like, oh my God, who grew up in Ukraine or who has family in Ukraine or whatever, people, once they know who you are. And I think it's so important to be your own advocate, not assuming everyone's going to be looking at your LinkedIn or whatever. You need to be putting the information about you out there. And the other thing I love about what you said is, when you do advocate for yourself, right, as opposed to thinking, oh, well, what if that cost me the job? Because I think that's something that a lot of college students or early career journalists might think, especially in this current, we're not sure where the economy is going. And certainly this profession has always, had its challenges. But I think like if I'm willing to advocate for myself, when I go out there as a reporter, working for John, like I'm going to be advocating and pushing to get that story and for, advocating for the company, advocating for the story. So I think it's so important that those skills, again, so all comes back to what you were saying, Alex, right? Teaching you how to value me, right? Based on all these things that I'm bringing to the table. So, yeah, I love that. I think that's so great. We're going to go to questions in a minute, but I wanted to get to a couple of, I think questions that we all have. So now we talked about the value proposition, I think is so important, really, really establishing that. But Alex, eventually we are going to get to the numbers. And, even though we all say, a lot of us have heard the advice, never be the first person to throw out a number. There's going to come a time where I'm sitting across the table from you and you're going to say, so what is your salary expectation for this job? And so I'm on the spot. And I can't say, I'd prefer not to say. So Alex, what is your advice for how I might answer that question?
Yeah. So if you have really good information, right? Like you have people on the inside, you feel very confident that you know what the range is, it's okay at that point to say, well, we've had a long discussion, right? You've told me your biggest priorities. We've talked about how this would be a fantastic match. And from the, many connections I have within this industry and all my research, I know that here is the range and it normally goes by these criteria. And so my expectation would be that we would be in the blank range, right? You can do that if you are rock solid. If you're not, the risk is that you're going to come in and undervalue you, right? And then Cindy, as another expert mentioned in your article, this is a business. And I would love it. I love when I hear about managers saying, no, you're not going to undervalue yourself. I know that you said you want 40,000, but here at Politico, with your experience, we pay whatever it is, right? I love that. And by the way, any manager who does that, that person is going to work their tail off for you, right? For life. That's the kind of thing you do to really get the best out of somebody. But if you don't know, then what I would recommend saying is, great, I'd love to discuss salary. Every organization values this role differently. So I'd like to hear, sorry, John, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how Politico thinks about this position, right? So I would try to toss it back to them, right? And it is true that every company thinks about these things differently. So I would try to get all the information you can before throwing out a number if you have to. But a lot of people I counsel have used that tactic, and the company will then often fill in the gap and maybe even throw out a number or a range. Just so you know, almost nobody is going to offer you the max they have up front. Even in the pandemic, I was hosting negotiation power hours on Clubhouse, if anybody remembers that platform. And there were HR managers and hiring managers on there saying, nobody's negotiating with me, and I have at least 10% in my pocket that I can be giving. That was during the height of COVID. So
amazing.
You know, you have the leverage you should always try. If you are the person on this call who routinely undervalues yourself, I want you to imagine me standing behind you, tapping you on the shoulder, and I want you to ask for a minimum of 10% more, a minimum.
That's awesome. That is so good. And I think that's so important to understand that there are ways to answer those things without just jumping out with a number or whatever, and really understanding that you're on the same page. Now, if there is that the same way you would approach it if like no one's thrown out a number yet? And I'm like, all right, you know, is there a certain point? I guess that's what I want to say. Is there a certain point in the conversation? Because I'm not going to open with that, right? And say, well, before I agree to this interview, how much does it pay? But, you know, what do you think about like when is an appropriate time for me to bring it up if I've decided that, you know, it's time I need to know before we go further?
Yeah, I would say when you've invested, and I'd be curious, about John or Jeff's perspective on this as well, right? From the other side. But, if I feel like I've invested time and I have enough information now to understand how I'm going to bring value, right? How I have set that up and how they're thinking about the position, then I would go for it. And I don't know that I have a number of interviews or whatever. One thing I will say is that, sometimes people will tell me on the initial application, they'll force you to put a number. There are some larger companies that do that. And oftentimes what I and other negotiation counselors advise people to do is to put like a 0 in there. And then if there's a comment section saying like, I welcome the opportunity to discuss compensation, once we're in discussion.
I think that's a really good, good point. I am curious to ask John and Jeff to just weigh in on that. Like, are there any thoughts you guys have on like when it's appropriate, or even just based on a past interview? Like, oh, there was one interview where we got to this point and it was a natural arc of like, a moment to bring that up. Any advice there on when we bring up that number conversation?
I mean,
Well,
I would say certainly after. Sorry, John, go ahead.
No. Well, two things really quickly. One, and we mentioned this before, that makes that conversation a lot easier is because of now a number of positions, you have to advertise a range. So a lot of people come in knowing what the range is, which makes that conversation a lot easier. And then, of course, Alex, I'm sure would argue, then you negotiate up to near the end of the range, right? So that's one thing, and the other thing too that that we've seen, and not just at political but elsewhere, is that some people have called up and have said when they are scheduled for the interview, they've asked for an idea of what the position pays because they don't want to waste their time, and I respect that. So if someone asks for a range, someone who I would be interested in hiring, at that point I would reveal what the range is, because it's either if this is someone that I really want, then it's someone that we can continue a conversation, and you don't want to waste anyone's time.
Yeah, I would just say that, I think you really, before you start talking about money, make a case for yourself. I was a hiring manager for 15 years, and I never cease to be amazed at how many people did a minimum of research on the job, the company that they were applying for. And it's just, it really, I know this has been said time and time again, I want a second, third, or fourth the importance of research. It's not just about the salary range, it's about the job content. It's about what the publication you're interviewing for has published in the last couple of days. Show you care, show you're interested, show you're curious, and maybe give some ideas, and or just even compliment something that you saw in the paper or the publication in the last few days that you thought was really good, and say why you thought it was good. That means so much, because this is a negotiation, but it's also creating a personal connection with somebody who could be your boss. Show you've got the enthusiasm and the drive. And if I saw that, right early on in an interview, that really helped to sell me. And on the flip side of that is, if all your questions are about benefits or salary, that kind of creates a bitter taste. And I'll never forget one interview. This is when I was interviewing for a bureau chief position in Taipei. It seemed to be going pretty well, and I asked the person, "Well, do you have any questions?" At the very end of the interview, and this person said, "Yes, does this job come with free parking?" And that person did not get the job. I mean, they were very good on paper, but that one thing, it's just, you've really got to show that, yeah, you deserve and you demand a fair salary, but you got to show you're worth it before you get to that step. That's my advice.
I think that's really great advice. Thank you so much, Jeff. Alex, that actually brings up a good point, because obviously, there's going to be times, especially in a tough economic environment, where maybe that people aren't willing to, or aren't able to have the budget to give you the higher end of the range. So we have a question from Jake Betzel from Southern Methodist University in the chat. And his question is, are there any thoughts on the best non-salary items to negotiate and sort of how you go about that? So I guess we learned, don't just blurt out, do you have free parking? But Alex, what is your advice for I'm not going to get the money. What else can I try to angle for, and how do I do it?
Got it. And first of all, Jeff, that is an iconic example. If I can, I'm going to get to the non-monetary things or the other things in just a second, but I wanted to say two quick things. Number one, if John has a range, right, and he's laid that out in the job description, the first thing I'm not going to do, John, is actually go in and be like, I'm asking for the top. First, I'm going to say, I will, but that's not the first thing I'm going to do. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you a question and say, John, I see that you've got this range. I really appreciate that. Can you tell me a bit about how Political thinks about that range, right? Because I'd like to understand from your perspective, right, what merits the top of the range and what's toward the lower end of the range. Is it years of experience? Is it qualifications? Is it qualities, right? Like the hustle, the ability to break stories, the entrepreneurial spirit, right? All of that stuff, so that I can intelligently make a claim. The other thing I wanted to say relating to Jeff's excellent example is, guys, what is one of the first things you do as a journalist? You research, right? So I am not going into an interview with Jeff unless I'm first going to be able to be like, hey, I saw you were in Hong Kong, right, for a period of time at a university there, Jeff. I actually spent time in Hong Kong, connect on that, right? Do people the honor, get their name right, especially if it's a name that's not familiar to you, pronounce people's names right, and also come in interested in who they are, their background, make the connection. The relationship creates the deal and not the other way around. It's always about the relationship first. I thought that was awesome advice from Jeff. Okay, the question on other stuff. Jake, I thought this was a fantastic question. Ultimately, this is going to be different for every person. So in Ask for More, the book I wrote, one of the questions that I have you ask before you go into a negotiation with somebody else is, what do I need? And I have you make a list of what I call the tangibles and the intangibles, right? So the tangibles are the things you can touch, see, or count, right? Like salary, it could be a certain level of healthcare, quantifiable healthcare benefits. It could be title, maybe resources. Maybe John's going to tell me I have a certain amount of budget to work with, right, for research or whatever else there might be, okay? But then there's other things, like the intangible. What do you value in life? Maybe I value challenge. what does that look like for me? Maybe that means that I get to shadow somebody who's working on a big story, right? And learn from that person. Maybe I value mentorship. And so, John, I'd like to know what mentorship opportunities are available for me at Politico. But it could be anything from different healthcare benefits. It could be training, right? It could be, I'd love to go to these 2 conferences in my field, Jeff, because that's where I'm going to be able to make these connections that are going to help me contribute to the organization. It could be remote work. In the spirit of what Jeff mentioned, I wouldn't ask about remote work as question 1, right? I'm first getting to know him, the organization. I'm selling them on the fact that they really need me. And then I'm having a collaborative discussion about when and how I'm going to work. So each one of you will have a different list of what's important to you. And so I would suggest thinking about those intangibles, what they are for you. And in every case, show how it benefits the company. You know, Jeff, I've worked from home for the last year. I've been unbelievably productive. Here's my rate of productivity. I'm actually more productive at home than I am in the office sometimes. It's, you know, therefore in your interest, that type of thing.
That's so great. I really appreciate that, Alex. I
Yeah,
think that's, yeah, go ahead, Tom.
If I can add one more, Alex, to your list that not enough people ask about is vacation. They can ask for an extra week, in some cases 2, of vacation. And that is a very valuable thing. Although, you know, at Politico, that doesn't matter as much because we have unlimited vacations. It takes that away. But for companies that don't, that is something that, in fact, in previous jobs, I've asked for that and have gotten that because that's valuable to me. The other one, really briefly, I wanted to add is that when you're talking, when someone comes in and said, you know, some would say, I have researched you, and you know, and that doesn't do sometimes it sounds a little bit creepy. But if someone says, you know, when you were in Miami at the time you spent at the Miami Herald, and I know that you were, the Herald is really big, was uncovering Latin America and the Caribbean, and for example, you know, the Herald was known for the big series that you led on Afro-Latin Americans. You know, let's talk about that. So it shows that someone is, and clearly they've researched me and what I've done, but they go further instead of, I've researched you. And I've had that happen so many times.
That is such a good point. And I do think you want to, you know, it's very easy to go to the tip to the creepy side, right? When we're talking about doing research. So that's a great point about doing it the right way and in a meaningful way that adds value. I do have a question for you guys, and this comes from Dan Micah. And by the way, we have a few minutes left, so if anybody else has other questions, please drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to all of them. So Dan Micah's question is, how do you approach asking for a higher salary in an environment when the media industry has been shedding jobs over the past several years? And he gave as an example that CTV just cut more than 1,000 positions this week. So I think that's a fair point. You know, we don't want to not advocate for ourselves, right? It doesn't mean that I should just stop advocating for myself. But how do you go about that in an environment like this? That's a good question. Thanks, Dan.
I have one quick tip. The quick tip is to use and instead of but. So instead of, I know times are tough and we've had job losses, but you know, I also need to be valued appropriately. It could be, right? If the employer says, yeah, you know, Alex, things have been tough. Yes, you know, I know that things have been tough. And I also know that in this position, I'm poised to bring a tremendous amount of value. For example, we all know that people who watch business news, right, might be significantly more affluent than the average person. And so therefore, these stories are going to be engaging, you know, a really key demographic for you that's going to benefit the company significantly and help pull us out, right? So, and instead of but.
That's a really great point, Alex. I really appreciate that. Because one thing I had also wanted to mention as we were kind of going through that list of things that might make you more valuable, whatever, you know, especially working in digital media, which is where I came from, you know, traffic, the ability to get people to read your stories, you know, or knowing audience growth techniques, knowing social media, those kind of things add value And those are things that if you're doing them, or like we talked with John about being able to do podcasts or being able to do public speaking, that you're bringing extra value. So, but I also know these things are, and I also know these things are important to you, and I bring this to the table. So I think that's really good. And yeah, I mean, and I appreciate that, certainly as a journalist, like we work in words. And so, and versus but is not something I would have thought of in interviews and negotiations, but I think it's a really, really important point. We have another question in the chat from Aliyah Dasu. Aliyah, I hope I said your name right. Her question is, any tips for asking for your first raise? And is that different from an initial salary negotiation?
So I want to note that I saw Jeff had something to say. I'm going to be super pithy on this and then would love to hear his point on the last thing. Aliyah, this is a political campaign, okay? So in a job negotiation, you might have one big conversation, right? And everybody knows what the timing is. Maybe you have a few rounds. Once you're going for your promotion, and especially for your first promotion as a woman, right, or a woman of color, this is important. Get your allies and advocates to speak for you, in addition to you being able to make your case. If John is my manager, I'm not waiting until the performance review or the raises are set to go in and ask him. I'm going into him 6 months in advance and saying, John, I've been here for a year. I just want to be transparent with you. I love it here. I'd like to move up at some point. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on my performance to date, and how can I help you make the case for this? What do we need to show together? How can I bring that to you? Like, let's partner together on this, right? And treat it like a political campaign that you're starting early.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Jeff, what did you want to add to that?
I forgot what I was going to say to the earlier point, but this is a much more important one anyway. And just that, like Alex said, it's not a question of waiting until a year is up to start negotiating. Keep track of the really great work that you do throughout the year. In a way, like you're kind of writing your own performance review. And if you've ever managed someone and you're a good manager, you're keeping track of all the great things they do and maybe some of the not so great things they do throughout the year. You're keeping a list. And, if you have a particularly great scoop or you do really well on this one particular thing, make sure your boss knows about it. It's not so much as like, hey, boss, look what I did. Get one of your friends to kind of point it out. Get one of your allies to point it out. Just make sure they're aware of it at the time. Put it on a list. And when the time comes for your review or however they work the salary raise process, have your list with you and make sure you remind them of all these wonderful things you did throughout the year.
Thank you so much. Sorry,
Cindy, if I could this is so key, folks. What Jeff just told you is really important. You can do it yourself also. Jeff, I'd love to give people a script for that, okay? If John is my boss, I would email John and say, John, just got this incredibly great feedback on the story. Thank you as always for your support, right? Or I just got this scoop. I want to thank you, right, for the training, for the resources, whatever it is. Like, thank you for always being my champion and believing in me on this. If you are thanking somebody, there is no reason that you can't send this stuff and say, I'm super proud of this. Thank you so much for always being in my corner.
I love that. I think that's all so important. And I wanted to take this opportunity to mention, because this is a great segue, this webinar today is actually part of a 3-part series. So we're going to get more into this topic about how to move up the ladder and those things you need to know, the difference between like a mentor and an advocate, and, documenting the things that you've done, and, figuring out, where am I now? Where do I want to go? What do I need to do in the middle? What skills? What do I know? Who do I need? That's such a great point, Alex, saying to your boss, not just like hoping that someone notices you, you have to put those things out there. I will never forget that someone that I worked with in the past was always raising her hand and pointing out the things that she did or whatever. And I thought, oh God, this girl all the time is saying the things that she did. She got promoted way before I did. So, so it's really important. You are your own advocate. And even if it's not your personality type, you don't want to come across as braggy or anything like that. You have to check that. Whatever you normally are, you have to check that at the door and get out there and advocate for yourself, like Alex. And so, yeah, so Tess just actually dropped that link in the chat. So that is going to be August 16th, that webinar, and it's going to feature as one of our panelists, Gorik Ng, who is a career advisor for Harvard and who wrote a book called The Unspoken Rules at Work, which I think is so important because it's not just about, like Alex was saying, it's not just about showing up and doing a good job and working hard. You know, it's all those things, but then there's so many other pieces. So we're really going to dig into that. It's also going to feature Robert Barba from the Wall Street Journal and Danielle Abril from the Washington Post. So I'm really excited about that. I apologize, we are out of time, but I wanted to just give the panelists one quick opportunity to let us know, you know, in kind of closing thoughts on like, what are the risks if I don't negotiate?
You know, I'm going to answer a slightly different question, Cindy. Some folks on the call may be thinking, oh God, like I didn't negotiate. If the best time to negotiate was yesterday, the second best time is today. Okay. And I'm here to tell you that probably every single one of us on this panel has had moments where we didn't maybe ask for everything we could. I know I'm in that category and I teach this stuff. Okay. So what I'm going to say is today is the best day to start. Right. So keep track of your qualifications, keep track of your accomplishments, right? And go forth and negotiate. You're worth it.
And if I can add to what Alex said, certainly negotiate. It's probably not the best thing coming from my side of the table to say, but I think it's particularly young people have that as something that you do routinely. And also, as you negotiate, if there's not much give on the salary, we talked about it earlier, there are a number of other things you can ask for. So, just don't go back into your corner and say, I'm not going to get a higher salary, I'm done. But just think creatively about what else you can work out with the company. And in many cases, you'll end up getting everything from a signing bonus to, as I mentioned earlier, more vacation time.
Yeah, I mean, just one point I wanted to make is not everyone is comfortable negotiating, and not everyone is comfortable reminding their boss about what a wonderful job they're doing. And sadly, I fall into this category, and it can be really, really tough to promote what you do. And for those of you who feel uncomfortable doing it, you have a lot of potential allies, and you have other ways to compensate for that, like keeping a list. You might undervalue routinely what you do, but if you keep track of all the little accomplishments, the little triumphs, keep a list, remind yourself of it, and that will make it a lot easier to negotiate when you have to and to promote yourself when you have to, even if you're uncomfortable doing it.
Jeff, you should call me next time you need somebody. Okay.
I'm going to. Thank you. I need help. I need help, definitely.
It's not just women, right? A lot of us struggle with this. Last thing I'll say, the only reason I'm sitting here today is because I managed to write a book proposal that talked about me in glowing terms. I had to write it myself. So if you're receiving value from this webinar today, know that the only reason you're talking to us is that I sucked it up, got over my imposter syndrome, and claimed my expertise, right? So when you claim your expertise, you open up opportunities to serve people, right? So don't make them wait. That's you too, Jeff and John, right? Get out there and let people know what you have so that you can be of service to others.
That is all such great advice, such an important point. And yes, if you have not read Alex's book, I highly recommend it. Her book is Ask for More, 10 Questions to Negotiate Anything. So I wanted to thank all of the panelists today. You guys, this was amazing. I could keep talking to you for several more hours, but I thank you for your time and your expertise today. Alexandra Carter, John Yearwood, Jeffrey Timmermans, so grateful to all of you guys. Thank you to everyone else who came today. And one thing I wanted to point out, that if you know people who didn't make it, or you want to watch us on replay, you kind of want to go back and take more notes or something, SABEW will have a recording of this on SABEW's website within the next 48 hours. So if you follow SABEW on Twitter @SABEW, they will post when the video is live. And also stay tuned to that events page, sabew.org/events. And also if you're following them on Twitter, for when you can sign up for the next 2 sessions of this series for college students and early career journalists. As I mentioned, August 16th is how to move up the ladder in your career. And then in the fall, in September, the date is TBD. We will have something on how to set up your first budget. Because once you ask for more, you need to know from the get-go how to manage your money well so that you have enough that you need and you're not worrying about it. So thank you guys so much. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Cindy.